I want you to pause for a second, because what you're about to hear is not a story about peace. It's a story about price. In recent months, the word peace has followed Donald Trump everywhere. Peace deals, peace ceremonies, peace prizes, from Eastern Europe to Central Africa, from the Caucasus to South Asia. But look closer, and a different pattern appears. Everywhere peace is announced, critical minerals sit quietly underneath. Lithium, cobalt, graphite, uranium, the raw materials of batteries, missiles, data centers, and modern power. This is not idealism. It is leverage. Trump's version of peace does not begin with trust or reconciliation. It begins with stakes, with contracts, with access. And the question is not whether this strategy is clever. It is whether peace, once priced and packaged, can actually last. If this perspective challenges how you think about global diplomacy, stay with me. Because to understand what's happening now, we first need to clarify what kind of peace this really is. And that takes us to the core of the problem. To understand this moment, we have to strip away the ceremony. What the Trump administration calls peace is not an end state. It is a framework where conflict is paused, not resolved, where ceasefires are paired with corridors, where signatures come with extraction rights, transit routes, and long-term access. This is a shift from diplomacy as mediation to diplomacy as alignment of incentives. The logic is simple. If the United States embeds itself economically into a conflict zone through minerals, energy, infrastructure, then instability becomes expensive for everyone involved. Peace in this model is not moral. It is mutually costly to break. That is why so many of these deals look similar. A joint fund here, preferential access there, a 99-year development right buried in the fine print. The administration argues this creates durable stability. Critics argue it creates fragile truces held together by money. And before we judge whether it works, we need to understand where this idea comes from and why it is resurfacing now in a world defined by scarcity. That story begins long before these agreements were signed. This strategy didn't emerge in a vacuum. It is rooted in a deeper shift in how power works in the 21st century. For most of the post-Cold War era, globalization was built on abundance, cheap energy, open supply chains, the assumption that markets would smooth over politics. That era is over. Today's global economy runs on bottlenecks, not flows. Rare earths, battery minerals, energy corridors that can be blocked, sanctioned, or weaponized. China understood this early. It spent decades locking up supply chains, not battlefields, mining abroad, processing at home, turning geology into leverage. The Trump administration's response was not to reverse globalization, but to renegotiate it under pressure. If minerals are the new oil, then conflict zones are the new Persian Gulf, and peace becomes a tool to secure access before rivals do. In this context, diplomacy is no longer about settling disputes. It is about positioning inside them. But when peace is shaped by scarcity rather than reconciliation, it carries a different kind of risk. And that risk becomes visible the moment theory meets reality, which is exactly what happened next. The first real stress test came in Ukraine. On paper, the deal looked elegant. A joint fund, energy, infrastructure, critical minerals, a way for Washington to anchor itself inside Ukraine's future economically and strategically. Ukraine would contribute half of its future revenues from critical minerals and new energy licenses. The United States would recover its defense investments and help finance reconstruction. This was not just aid, it was equity. The logic was clear. If America has skin in the ground, it has a reason to stay. And if America stays, Russia must calculate differently. But here's where the model cracked. Many of Ukraine's most valuable deposits sit in the Donbass. territory still contested, still bleeding. Any shift on the battlefield could instantly erase the economic foundation of the deal. Peace, in this case, became conditional on geography, on who controls the soil beneath the slogans, and quietly another idea entered the conversation, that parts of contested land might be ceded to make the numbers work. That is the danger of transactional peace. When value is mapped underground, borders start to look negotiable. If you find this unsettling, you should, because Ukraine is not the exception. It is the prototype, and what comes next reveals the system even more clearly. What Ukraine exposed was not a flaw in execution, but a feature of the design. This model of peace runs on extraction logic. At its core is a belief that conflict can be stabilized if enough value is locked into the system. Not resolved, stabilized, long enough for contracts to mature, long enough for infrastructure to pay off. That is why minerals matter so much. They are immobile. They cannot flee when politics shift. They tie foreign powers to local ground for decades. But this also means peace becomes dependent on control, not consent. Who guards the mines? Who secures the corridors? Who decides which regions are too valuable to be allowed chaos? In this framework, diplomacy stops being about healing fractures. It becomes about managing risk around assets, and that creates a dangerous inversion. Violence is no longer the primary failure. Instability is only when it threatens returns. This is why transactional peace often tolerates suffering as long as extraction continues. You can see it in the fine print of these agreements. Security guarantees implied, not promised. Ceasefires encouraged, not enforced. Local grievances acknowledged, then postponed. The system doesn't ask whether the conflict is solved, only whether it is contained, and containment has limits. Those limits become brutally clear when we look at Central Africa, where peace was signed, but violence never stopped. In Eastern Congo, those limits are impossible to ignore. On paper, the DRC-Rwanda agreement looked like a diplomatic breakthrough. Disengagement, disarmament, mutual respect for borders, and standing just off stage, a strategic minerals partnership with the United States. Cobalt, coltan, lithium, uranium, the raw materials of the green transition mined in one of the most violent regions on Earth. Washington offered preferential access, infrastructure corridors to Western markets, security cooperation to stabilize production. But on the ground, almost nothing changed. Militias remained active. Civilians kept fleeing. Atrocities continued before, during, and after the signing ceremonies, because the deal addressed flows, not forces. It treated violence as a disruption to supply, not a political reality rooted in decades of trauma. In this model, peace does not need to reach villages. It only needs to reach minds. And when stability is measured in output rather than safety, suffering becomes background noise. This is the moment where transactional peace reveals its moral blind spot. If violence doesn't interrupt extraction, it doesn't trigger urgency. For the people living there, peace exists on paper. For the system, that is often enough. But the consequences don't stop at borders, because when peace is designed this way, its effects ripple outward to regions that look calm but aren't. And that brings us to the lives caught in between. Now, shift your focus away from capitals and contracts. Look at the people who live where these deals land. If you are a farmer near a mineral corridor, peace does not arrive as security. It arrives as fences. If you are a family near a mine, peace does not mean silence at night. It means more checkpoints, more armed men, more rules you didn't help write. You are told this is stability. That investment will trickle down. That extraction will eventually mean schools, roads, hospitals. But time moves differently when you're the one waiting. your life becomes collateral. Your safety secondary to output targets, your suffering tolerated because it doesn't interrupt supply. And here is the cruel paradox. The more valuable your land becomes, the less your voice matters. Because peace in this system is designed for markets, not communities. If this feels uncomfortable, it should. Because real peace is not something you observe from afar. It's something you feel in your daily routine, in whether your children walk to school safely, in whether tomorrow feels predictable. If you believe peace should mean more than stability for investors, then this conversation matters. Stay with me. Because when local lives are treated as variables, the consequences never remain local. They scale. And that takes us to the global ripple effects of buying peace this way. When peace is negotiated through minerals, its impact doesn't stop at borders. It restructures global power. Every corridor redraws trade routes. Every preferential access deal shifts supply chains. Every agreement quietly moves leverage from one capital to another. For Washington, this strategy is about insurance, reducing dependence on China, locking in alternatives before scarcity turns into crisis. But globally, it creates a new kind of competition, not over ideology, but over who gets written into the ground. Countries that sit on critical minerals become strategic terrain, not allies, not partners. Terrain, their internal stability becomes a global concern only when it threatens flows outward. And their conflicts attract attention not because they burn, but because they block. This accelerates a dangerous trend. Peace negotiations become less about ending wars and more about positioning great powers inside unresolved ones. That makes conflicts harder to truly end because too many external interests become invested in controlled instability. A frozen conflict can be useful. A managed crisis can be profitable. A fully resolved peace can actually reduce leverage. History offers warnings here. Economic interdependence was once supposed to prevent war in Europe. Instead, it created dependencies that limited response when war came. The same risk is emerging again, this time underground. And once peace becomes a tool of competition, its future depends not on reconciliation, but on who can afford to hold the line. Which raises the final question, if this is the trajectory, where does it lead? That brings us to the futures now unfolding. We can now see three possible futures taking shape. The first is the optimistic scenario. Economic stakes do what diplomats could not. Investments mature, corridors stay open. Local elites calculate that peace is more profitable than war. In this world, transactional peace slowly hardens into real stability. Not because wounds heal, but because restarting violence becomes too costly. The second is the middle path, the most likely one. Conflicts cool, but never close. Violence drops, then spikes. Deals survive, but trust never does. Peace exists, but only as maintenance. Constant renegotiation, constant external management, a system permanently on life support, and then there is the worst-case scenario. Minerals deepen grievances. Corridors become targets. Foreign stakes turn local conflicts into proxy contests. Peace collapses the moment returns fall or politics shift. In this future, transactional peace doesn't prevent war. It reshapes it. The core question is not whether Trump's approach is rational. It is whether a system that prices peace can survive moments when peace is no longer profitable. Because once diplomacy is reduced to balance sheets, morality disappears from the equation. And systems without moral limits eventually test their own breaking point. Which brings us to the final insight. Here is the final truth we have to sit with. Peace built on minerals is not fake, but it is conditional. It lasts only as long as the incentives hold, only as long as contracts remain profitable, only as long as power stays aligned. That makes it efficient and dangerously fragile. Donald Trump's approach did not invent this logic. It exposed it In a world defined by scarcity, diplomacy is no longer about ideals. It is about access. And access, once secured, becomes a reason to stay, even when justice is unfinished. The real question is not whether this strategy can pause wars. It clearly can. The question is whether a world that treats peace as an asset is prepared for the moment when that asset depreciates. Because when peace is priced, someone always decides what it's worth. If this analysis helped you see global politics more clearly, take a moment to reflect and share it with someone who still believes peace is simple. In the next video, we'll go deeper. We'll examine what happens when resource diplomacy collides with democracy and why the next global conflicts may be decided less by armies and more by what lies beneath our feet. Stay curious, because understanding power is the first step to not being ruled by it.